Business Disability Forum. Creating a disability-smart world together. Skipton Building Society. Inclusive Communication Toolkit.
Good morning and welcome to the Business Disability Forum Inclusive Communications Toolkit launch panel discussion. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it, in terms of inclusive communications? I'm Diane Lightfoot. I'm Chief Executive of Business Disability Forum, and I'm going to be your host for today. And I'm really delighted that we are here to talk about our new Inclusive Communications Toolkit, which has been very kindly sponsored by Skipton Building Society. The first thing to say is that we have My Clear Text joining us today, and if you require captions, you can click the closed captions icon on the menu at the bottom of your screen, or follow the stream text link in the chat box, which is already there, for a full screen version of the transcript. So communication is a key part of all our jobs. It is not just the domain of communications teams and professionals. So whether it's writing a letter to a customer or client, or sending a quick email to a colleague, that's communication, and it's our way of sharing information. And of course, how we communicate will affect how clearly our message is received and acted upon. I know that there are over 100 people registered to attend this webinar, so clearly there are lots of you who realise how important this topic is. So we've created our new Inclusive Communications Toolkit to support you to make sure that disabled customers and colleagues are included in your communications, and to show you how you can create information that everyone can understand and access. The toolkit is freely available to all our members and partners. It includes practical resources which offer tips and advice on making information more inclusive and accessible in your day-to-day work. And there is also a deeper dive section for communication professionals, which has in-depth advice on creating and communicating an inclusion communication strategy across your organisation. And we're going to be talking a bit about that a bit later on this morning. There's also a best practice section, which includes blogs, videos, and examples on inclusive and accessible communications. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to see it, we have created a video for the launch of the toolkit, which you can see on our YouTube channel after the webinar has taken place, and that will also be on our website shortly. So I'm delighted this morning to be joined by a panel of experts, all of whom have been involved in the creation of the toolkit. And in a moment, I'll ask them all to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their role. I will then be asking some questions to each of our speakers before opening it up to delegates for your questions. So please do have your thinking hats on as you go through, if there's anything that you would like to ask or follow up on when we get to that. So, introductions. Firstly, Sarah Bartlett, who's the writer of our toolkit.
Hi. Hello.
Hector Minto.
Just bringing myself off mute there. Sorry, hi Diane. So hi everyone, I'm Hector Minto. I'm the Accessibility Evangelist for Europe at Microsoft. Essentially my role is to build awareness about digital inclusion and accessibility, both internally and externally with our customers.
Thank you, Hector. Great to have you with us. And great to have you too, Sarah. I should have said that as well. And then Tracy.
Hi, my name's Tracy Lenthal. I'm an HR director at a large professional services organisation. I am dyslexic, diagnosed at 16, so have experienced the world through the lens of 10% of the population who has a learning disability. And so communication has been an issue for me, and has also in how I express myself, and also on the receiving end of communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Great to have you too. And also thank you for your contribution to the toolkit, which is really very, very powerful. Then if I can come to Catherine.
Oh, hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Catherine Brynja, and I'm the founder and director of Big Voice Communications, a specialist inclusive communications consultancy. And I was really delighted to be able to contribute to the toolkit, and I think it's a fantastic resource.
Thank you, and thank you for helping us, particularly with the deeper dive section for comms professionals. Then I'll come to Angela.
Morning everyone, I'm Angela. I am Head of Policy and Advice at Business Disability Forum. So in my role, I lead the advice team. So later on during this webinar, I'll be talking a little bit about the types of queries about inclusive communications that we get from you, our members.
Lovely, thank you, Angela. That's really helpful. And last but not least, Jacob.
Hi everyone, I'm Jacob, Spargo-Mabbs. I'm technical writer and content creator at BDF, and I've been project managing the creation of this toolkit, so I'll be talking from that perspective.
Lovely, thank you, Jacob. We also have my colleague Bella Gore. She's invisible, but she is there on the line today, and she will be keeping an eye out for questions from the audience. So if there is a question that you'd like to ask, please do type it into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to come first to you, Sarah. So a very small and easy question to start us off. What is inclusive communications?
Right. There you go. Sorry, I was on mute, then I was off mute, and now I'm speaking again. There we go. Great. Okay. Yeah, no, that is a good question to start with, because I guess it is one of those terms in itself where people think, actually, is that, what does that actually mean? So I would say inclusive communication begins with an understanding that not everyone communicates and processes information in the same way. So in order to communicate clearly with everybody, you need to make sure people are involved in your communication and are represented in your communication. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Put it in a
Thank you,
nutshell.
Sarah. And what top advice, I know it's probably hard to pick, but what top advice would you give to our audience?
Well, I think my top advice would probably be to involve people in your communication. So your customers, your employees. In this toolkit, we've obviously given quite general advice, but I think the key thing is to always check with people, never assume. So that, that use this toolkit to help you begin looking at your communication, begin conversations, but always check what people's preferences and needs are to make sure that you are meeting those. And also, I think to understand that it's a journey. You might not always get it right, but that's okay. Be ready to make changes and keep reviewing your communication as well. There's some really fantastic resources in the deeper dive section created by my lovely colleague here, Catherine Grinier, who she talks there about how to review your communications like ongoing. So yeah, keep that in mind, I would say.
Thank you, Sarah. And I mean, always asking is very good advice. And also, I think the point that this is something that organisations are often just starting out on, and not to be afraid of trying it out. And if you do get things wrong, you can put them right. I mean, the reason we created this toolkit was that there was nothing else out there like this. So we hope it really makes a difference. So, Angela, part of your role is overseeing the advice service. So what sort of questions does the advice service get when discussing inclusive communications?
Yes, so a very broad range of queries. So at the moment, one of our most popular queries related to inclusive communications are people are reviewing their logos, or they've recently merged, or they're creating a new logo to represent how they're a brand change, for example. So we get a lot of our members say that these are the options of the logos we've got or that have been designed so far. Are they accessible? What do you think about them? And then some of the things we talk about there are font, colour of font, style of font against the colour background, the simplicity of the design, and also we talk about the role of usability as well, and who's been involved in designing that logo. Has there been a strong representation of diversity in terms of creating in the design of that, from, as Sarah said, people who process information differently to people who have a whole range of different perspectives and conditions and disabilities as well. The other key, really common query we get is from customer services, so everything from local authorities to banks, and also from public services, so for example the NHS or regulatory bodies. And they tend to, those sectors often ask us, how many alternative formats do I need to keep in stock? So for example, do I need to keep 5,000 Braille versions of our customer leaflet? Do I need to keep CDs and audio versions of this in a huge stockroom that we just don't have space for? So there's a lot of queries coming through from people who want to do the right thing and are wondering, you know, what are the general expectations in terms of how quickly we need to respond to providing an alternative format? And one of the things we discussed there is just, first of all, knowing your audience, really. For some customer settings, that's easier than others when you've got sort of a regular demographic of people who are using your service. But also, if you also, as Sarah said, about reviewing the adjustments you'll get, the requests you're getting through. So for example, if you are getting requests that are predominantly for an audio version or a large print version, then that gives you an idea of what potentially to keep in stock. But for the most part, we see that when people need or something is requested, such as a British Sign Language version or a Makaton version, for example, or an easy read, we usually see that actually the processes to get that quickly are not in place. So for the most part, it's knowing when this is requested, does everyone who's receiving that request know how to get it in a timely way, and to discuss the requirement with the customer as well. And then the last thing in terms of the top common query is just a very general query, which I always find fascinating. And depending on who I'm having the conversation with, that it can go in a variety of different ways. It's just, we've got PDFs, we've got Word versions. How do I make that accessible? So we talk about the idea of what accessibility is, and as Sarah said at the beginning, it's this idea. We talk about the idea that accessibility isn't something fixed, and knowing the audience and knowing that people process things in really different ways. So within that, we get questions such as, well, actually, we're about to send out this huge, really important strategic communication to all of our workforce, particularly in the times of COVID, when people were changing their working patterns very, very quickly. We got a lot of these queries. So members would send us the draft of the communication that they were going to send out. And I think that the general idea can often be, you know, I'll tell my teams what to do, but then here will come the massively detailed, really long email that goes out to all of the workforce. So sometimes members will send us the draft of that communication. And some of the things we discuss in there is knowing your audience. So in all of your workforce, you've got very senior technical roles, but then you've got roles that are not technical, will not be familiar with technical language, and who are just not used to reading very long documents. So as the Communications Toolkit says, think about the role of plain English. Think about, does it really need to be this long? Sometimes if you want people to know really important stuff, it's important to keep it shorter and in a format that is digestible.
Thank you, Ange. Clearly loads of stuff there, and it's worth saying that we started doing this toolkit, the idea for it, way before COVID-19 had come upon us. And in the interviews I've been doing for the launch, we've been reflecting on the fact that arguably it's more important than ever in how we're working now, because we don't have those visual cues. I mean, even though we can see each other on the screen, it's not the same in terms of body language, etc. And actually the written word is having to do an awful lot more. So getting it right is ever more important. You also made me laugh when you mentioned CDs. I remember CD-ROMs being the future. And of course, technology now can help us with inclusive communications in a huge number of ways, which leads me neatly on to Hector. So Hector, why does an organisation like Microsoft believe this is such an important and significant area to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, just coming back on what Angela's talking about here, there is so much to share. It's almost like where to start. I think I'd probably just start, I mean, in terms of like why, you know, we're building a digital society. I mean, COVID has absolutely shown how quickly we can transform as a society. and we've made a lot of good decisions along the way in terms of inclusive behavior. But I think it's fair to say that we've also seen some really bad examples where governments, organizations are really struggling to get this inclusive communication piece right. In terms of Microsoft, I mean, we have a kind of a mission to empower every person on the planet to achieve more. I mean, that, you know, mission statements are great, but fundamentally, humans are communicating multimodally, you know, in loads of different ways all across the world. I mean, just the level of human communication has just gone through the roof, which also means that the influencers are much more easy to reach. Yeah. So when you think about like good reasons to be inclusive, this idea that you can just put out one document in one format and it will reach your audience in today's world is just not true. Right? So the focus is now coming back on organizations to be deliberately inclusive. Now, as Microsoft, obviously we're the tech vendor of choice for so many companies around the world. You know, if you think of all the people using Outlook or using Word, you know, we have a real opportunity to signpost inclusive behavior. And that's the bit we've been working on most, I would say, over the last few years. The technology is changing. You know, we've gone beyond CD-ROMs, you'll be pleased to hear, Diane. But you know, when we think about digital skills out there, to me, there's a transaction that needs to happen here now. Companies and organizations need to be humble and inclusive and willing to listen and willing to meet people, but they also have to build cultures where it's okay to ask for something in a different format. This idea that it's just there and you can ask for it is just not realistic now, because how do you build up the courage in an organization that's not confident about disability to ask for an alternative format? Why should you, as a citizen accessing that service, need to ask? Yeah, there's a piece here about if we just started to become more routinely inclusive in our behavior, you'll get less people asking, lower costs of actually people scrambling, yeah, and less fear of litigation or risk. Because that's the bit that people really worry about in businesses. They sit there and think, you know, I've got to do everything that's compliant. I think the opportunity now in this modern world is to move way beyond compliance, yeah, to a real culture of deliberately being inclusive. And just, I know I can talk forever, Diane, on this topic, but politicians are specifically interesting in this piece, yeah. So if you think of what we've been going through COVID, there was one parliament that did not get their inclusive communications right at the start, and then there were two others in the UK that did. Yeah, and one of them kind of took the attitude that it was the broadcaster's responsibilities to make stuff inclusive. The other said, we're going to get the inclusion right at the start, so anyone sharing this will be inclusive. So the other bit of advice I would always give people is start as high up the food chain as possible on the good inclusive behavior, because then as people share, you're not reliant on everybody else around the world to make stuff inclusive for you, because you got the inclusion right at the start. But the simple answer to your question, you know, communication is ramping up. Yeah, you know, more than ever, we're reaching individuals more than ever in society than we ever have done before. So there's a real need to be as diverse and inclusive in that communication as possible.
Thank you, Hector. And yes, I know you can talk about it for a long time, but it's always fascinating and it's always interesting, which is why we're delighted to have you on the panel. So thank you for that. I really like what you called about being deliberately inclusive. That's a really good term. And I think we have to be deliberately inclusive until we get to the point where it is so embedded it's a habit and it's just how we do things. And when you were talking as well, I was thinking of just the principles of inclusive design, and that's not just about actual design or buildings, it's also about processes and everything. Building in inclusivity and accessibility right from the start makes it so much easier and simpler and cheaper for everyone.
Can I just share one small thing that we do in Microsoft, just to add on that? So we have a lot of employees, okay, and we have a lot of partners around the world, but all of our templated PowerPoint slides have a holding, they're all accessible, designed accessible, technically, but then they have a holding slide that says, you're going to break the accessibility on this. Don't delete this slide before checking your document for accessibility and sharing it. So as I say, it's like the further you get that design up, you know, in the process, the more chance you've got that people will educate themselves. People want to do the right thing. That's my honest, like optimistic view of the world. I think when people know, they will do it. But getting that good design in at the very start is so important.
Yes. Completely. That's a very helpful practical tip, Hector, which I think we might nick, actually. So Microsoft is a great example of an organization that really lives inclusivity throughout your brand. And I know, Catherine, if I can come to you, that you talk a lot about brand, and that is where lots of companies are focusing. Do you think this is an area where they could be missing out by not really thinking about including their disabled customers?
Yeah, absolutely, Diane. Thank you. I think you know, first of all, your brand is more than your logo and the look and feel. You know, it's the lived experience of the people that work for your organisation and interact with your organisation as customers or stakeholders. So you would want every interaction with your organisation to be inclusive. I mean, just as, you know, Hector was describing, and I think by not thinking inclusively, and also reflecting that in your brand, you're missing out potentially on a massive part of your audience. So, you know, the question that you asked Hector at the beginning is why is Microsoft doing it? It's like, why wouldn't they? You know, why wouldn't you want to reach as many people as possible with your products and services? And your messages. So if your job is to communicate on behalf of your organization, you want to land that message with as many people as possible. You want to have that interaction, that dialogue, that conversation with as many people. So the 20% plus of the world's population that have a disability, you know, you want to be including them in your communications, and your brand is integral to that. And I think there are some notable examples. Hector mentioned the government example. I think that's a really good one. You know, it stands out when brands get it wrong. You notice, and I can think of another one, a historical example, and that was to do with the kind of logo or the animation. I think we can mention it now because it is in the past, and overall it was a huge success, and that was of course the London Olympics in 2012, and the furore they caused over their logo. For those who've got memories that go back long enough, you know, by not involving people in the design, you know, and it would have been a simple thing to get right. You know, you've got that opportunity, particularly when you're creating something new. Every time you create something new, every new campaign, every new project or product, you've got that opportunity to make it as good as it can be. And that to me is a really compelling, you know, business opportunity. But also it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't you it sums it up perfectly. And that's equally true of attracting disabled talent with your employer brand as it is attracting customers with your overall consumer brand, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know that historically, certainly, one of the objections to making branding inclusive is the idea that it maybe constrains creativity. So, you know, the sort of either inclusivity or looking nice. Do you have any suggestions around that?
Yeah, I do. You've got to push back. You know, if you want your brand to be accessible and inclusive, you have to make it so. You know, you have to be very clear on what your requirements are, and you have to make that challenge. And the challenge back to the creatives is this is part of a creative opportunity for you. Show us what you can do to make this brand accessible and inclusive to disabled people, and inclusive to everybody. And I have many instances. Some of my clients will tell you that I do push back, and you know, if you're setting out to be inclusive, you need to follow through and be confident in that assertion. You know, and that's where the toolkit will give you, you know, some great resources and some of the kind of, you know, arguments as to why, or perhaps the confidence just to do it. But you've got to be really clear and see it as a creative challenge. And if I may, Diane, I was involved in the rebranding of Business Disability Forum back in the day, and with the designer for your logo, there was a dispute over the Pantone of the blue. And one shade of the blue, you maybe don't know this story, but one shade of the blue didn't pass the accessibility test, and the shade that you have did, and I was absolutely adamant, and the designer really couldn't get it into his head as to why that was important to me or to the organization. And I said it absolutely is, because it's an organization that is all about promoting inclusion, so our brand has to be inclusive and reflect that. So I think that, I like to, my fellow communications professionals, whether you're in brand or marketing or social media or whichever aspect of comms you're working in, internal, employee, we're all doing sort of similar roles. You've got to be confident and push back and be clear about what you want and set down that challenge and set those expectations, put it into your brief and your requirements. And I think, that's the only way we're going to make progress.
I completely agree, and I didn't know that story about the logo. So thank you for making sure that our logo is accessible. That was before my time.
Before your time.
It was before my time. And I also was thinking about a conversation I had with Danny Payne from Skipton Building Society that you can see in the launch video. And we were talking about the fact that the argument about whether you have a nice design, a good design, or an accessible design is ridiculous, because if a design isn't accessible, it's not good. It's because it's not serving the purpose to do what it's set out to do, to communicate. So therefore it's not good design. Anyway, sorry, like you, Catherine, I could probably get quite passionate about this too. Hector, I realise that my next question for you is rather a leading question, but I'm sure you will answer it masterfully. Does inclusive comms underpin everything else?
Yeah, but it's not always at the top of everybody's agenda. Yeah, so readiness and training are critical. I mean, I think this is our biggest learning is that we offer accessibility training across everybody at Microsoft. Okay, so if you're a product builder, a technical person, a coder, there's a kind of deep understanding across that part of Microsoft that of course you have to build accessible because we have compliance and all these other things, right? But when you look at marketing, is there a real understanding that you need to be accessible? And interestingly, when we offer training up to people, so we have free training for all of our staff, obviously, and externally, I can share the link to that. When we offer this non-mandated training to people across the organization, I can tell you that our statistics in the UK, particularly where I'm based, is that M&O, marketing operations, takes as much training as our technical and services people. So leaders need to get across that it does underpin everything. So it's not just it's easy to say inclusion underpins everything, right? But you must offer the training and build the skills and be brave enough to call it out when it's not accessible. So I can tell you about senior leaders at Microsoft who, between myself and Jenny Leigh Flurry, the Chief Accessibility Officer at Microsoft, we have to sometimes send an uncomfortable email to remind them that this video wasn't captioned. And, that doesn't represent our brand. And you've got to have a certain humility in the organization to allow to kind of call that out when it happens. What's interesting now, as we've got a critical mass of readiness across the organization, is that I'm not the only one calling it out now. So it's this constant reminder that, actually there is no alt text on this. Look up Microsoft's main feed from the weekend. You'll see a lovely thread of where somebody went emoji crazy on National Emoji Day or World Emoji Awareness Day, and literally listed, they wrote the entire Microsoft logo in color square emojis. So you can imagine what that would sound like to somebody who was blind. Somebody called it out, and you've got to be humble enough to say, okay, I didn't, the person who posted that specific tweet didn't mind. So yes, of course it underpins everything. Leaders need to say it, but you also need to offer people the training and the feedback loop to help them along their way.
Yes, thank you, Hector. And firstly, I did not know that there was a World Emoji Day. That passed me by. I'm probably not the target audience, but yes, actually pointing out to people that though they might think that something looks funny or fun, actually, if someone is using a screen reader or whatever assistive tech, it's going to be a complete nightmare. And it is building that culture where it's okay to say, and that person actually gets to the point where they welcome the feedback. Well, I hope they welcome the feedback. So I now want to come to Tracy. So Tracy, in the intro, you shared a bit about your personal experience. So do you think things have improved in recent months or years?
Oh, I definitely think things have. There's no doubt about it. I think there is a much more awareness and probably a lot more knowledge. I think technology has probably really helped that. So if I think about, let's take the internet, obviously people's websites, and they are far more creative, more interactive, more appealing, I think, to individuals like myself than perhaps they were in the past. So I definitely think there's been a lot more momentum of change. I know within my own organisation, you notice much more when we communicate, there's always transcripts. So in other words, if somebody cannot say hear the video, there's always the transcript. If people can't, there's also not just sign language, there's the subtitles that go at the bottom. So there's a lot more support around different types of communication. I think going forward, there needs to be more around probably the written word and the amount of text that people tend to use, and also around just the bombardment of communication that we tend to do in this era at the moment, which has got a lot worse than perhaps in the past, which can be very, very overwhelming for certain individuals with certain learning disabilities, of just the amount of communication that is expected to be read.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it also, when you were talking, it reminded me of another really strong theme from the interviews from the video, which is when you make your communications inclusive, that's actually good for everyone. It's not just good for people who have a specific access need or a format need. So the fact that we have captions for this webinar, as we always do, and we always do for our events, it means you've got a transcript. So you can refer to that at any point. If you create things in easy read, so very simple text with pictures, it gets to the heart of the messaging, and it's much quicker for everyone to read. And I was also thinking as well that the styles of websites and mobile first, and the simplicity of design is great to be inclusive, but it's also much better for anyone who is trying to do things quickly, which I suspect is most of us. So it really shouldn't be seen as a niche thing that's just good for a small group of people. It actually benefits everyone. And Tracy, what are your hopes for the future in terms of accessible communications?
So my hope for the future, that it becomes, people are willing to talk about this, that people are open to listening and not shying away. I think sometimes I'm talking from the lens of being dyslexic, where I can experience that they don't really, people who see people who are dyslexic might think, oh, it is, I can't spell, or I can't read as quick, whereas it's much, much deeper than that. And so I hope that people can be a lot more open and willing to see the diversity in disability and communication. So for example, some websites have got so much information on there. There's so many pop-ups, there's so much animation going on. Being dyslexic, I get distracted within seconds of that type of communication. So that's too overwhelming for me, and I'm probably not going to go onto that person's site or that organization's site. I will go somewhere where it's a calmer, cleaner, well thought out, very succinct in their communication. So my hope for the future is that people are open to that conversation, to understanding how different people do interact in the world, and how they respond to communication.
Thank you. And the point around the diversity of disability is really, really important. I was recording a podcast yesterday as part of our new neurodiversity series, and with Professor Amanda Kirby, and we were making the point that not everyone who has dyslexia will be helped by having coloured paper. So you don't say, right, we'll have coloured paper and we've solved everything for everyone with dyslexia, because it's very individual, it's very personal. And that, going back to that key point that Sarah made right at the beginning, asking somebody what they need is so important in getting this right, isn't it? So I wanted to come back to you, Sarah, actually, if that leads us in nicely. Okay. Onto the toolkit itself.
Yes.
So where do you begin? Where did you begin when creating an inclusive communications toolkit?
Yes, that is a good question, because it's how long is a piece of string, I think, on that one, because you could go on forever about inclusive communications in terms of what we could have included, what we should have included maybe. And I know there are plans to keep building on the toolkit going forward. So if something's not in there, that's not to say it won't be in there going forwards. But we wanted to basically create something that was usable for as many people as possible. And so we tried to make it kind of aimed at kind of people that know something already about the topic and people that feel they don't know anything about the topic, so that you can sort of start from any point. And we've tried to gather kind of communications that we think are most relevant, communication channels we think are most relevant to most people's roles. And we also, I should say, worked with a fantastic steering group who we consulted with to ask them which communication channels they used and which resources they thought would be most useful to include. You'll probably notice that the toolkit doesn't focus on face-to-face communication, and we made that decision quite early on just because we felt there was already quite a lot of resources out there on that, and BGF's already created a lot of resources on that. So it was, we wanted to include in this more sort of digital, print, sort of written communication and looking at the alternatives as well. And I think given the times we're now in, as we've already touched on, hopefully that was a good decision, because obviously now we're not doing face-to-face communication as much as perhaps we would like, or as much as perhaps we were. So I hope that this will give people lots of advice on the sort of communications they are actually using right now.
Yes, it's proven to be even more kind of timely than we thought, actually.
Yeah.
What would you say was the most challenging part of writing the toolkit?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it really was, as we just said, really sort of knowing where to begin and where to end. And I think there's still a lot of new areas out there as well. So I think there's still areas of communication where maybe there isn't agreed best practice still, or it's still evolving. And so I suppose what we tried to do there is kind of pull together kind of all the opinions out there and to offer what we think would be best practice in that area. But knowing that, again, you know, it's all changing. And as we said at the beginning, it is a journey. So what might work might seem to be the best idea now, might in a few years' time have moved on again. But yes, I hope that sort of answers your question. I think we could have, there's 40 resources in the toolkit. So that shows how big it is. And I think if you'd given me another month, I would have written more, to be honest. I could have just gone on forever and ever. But hopefully we've kept it at a level where people don't, you know, not overwhelmed by it, and they can find something in there that's relevant to what they're doing each day, and also something that they can just make a change today on. I think it's really important. I think Hector has said this and Catherine has said this about getting buy-in high up on this, and that's really important. But also I think, you know, look at what you do on a day-to-day basis, and there will be small changes that you can make to your emails, to pictures, making sure you're using alt text. These things are all fairly straightforward to implement, and I'd say, you know, make a start on those.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, it could have gone on and on and on, couldn't it? And we wanted to strike the balance between making it sufficiently comprehensive but also not overwhelming, and structuring it into those different sections, like the deeper dive for comms professionals is partly to do that very thing. So we will add things to it, though, I think. So Jacob, what would you say to anyone who thinks they might have something interesting to add to the toolkit?
I would say get in touch, because I'm sure you do have something useful to add, because inclusive communication is one of those areas that's so, it can be so specialized to an organization or to an area of business, or to even to audiences. So it's hard to go into like the specific details that would apply to each organization. So things like case studies and examples from organizations who are out there doing communication inclusively will be hugely informative about what it looks like kind of at the coalface, or you know, a face-to-face, metaphorically speaking these days. Yeah, so yeah, it's just, it will be huge. It's really useful to know actually what people are doing on the ground with communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
So get in touch.
Yes, so please do get in touch if you've got anything you think is useful. And the steering group were very engaged and very involved throughout the project, so we're very grateful for them. And I was going to name check them at the end, but I probably should do that now because we keep talking about them. So the steering group was Skipton Building Society, Atos, Norton Rose Fulbright, Lambeth Council, Danske Bank, Dimensions, which is a learning disability organisation, Microsoft, Virgin Media, Croydon NHS Trust, London Fire Brigade and EAA. So quite a diverse range of different organisations there to make sure that it really, really did work for lots of different sectors. And also big thanks to Big Voice Communications, who also helped with the deeper dive section. So before I open up to the audience, just 2 more questions. Firstly to Jacob and then to Sarah. So Jacob, what would you say to an organisation that doesn't think they have employees that require more inclusive comms?
I'd say that's probably a really good reason to read the toolkit, because I think there's a really strong correlation between organisations that are doing inclusive communication badly and organisations that are complacent about inclusive communication. It's firstly, if you think you don't have employees that need inclusive communication, it's probably worth revisiting why you think that, because there's a lot of disabilities that might not be immediately apparent, and so you might have employees who do have needs for inclusive communication, but are kind of rumbling along with their own coping mechanisms, but could do so much better with inclusive communication, given more consideration. And secondly, I think it sends a really, if you're not considering inclusive communication, it can send a really negative message to future employees and also to customers or clients or partners, that this isn't something that you really think about, and you will be excluding them from working with you. So it's absolutely, if you think you don't need it, that's probably a really good indication that you do need it.
Yes, completely agree. And another huge topic, far too big for this webinar right now, that we get asked about is about how organisations can encourage more of their employees to tell them if they have a disability or a condition that's not immediately visible and they need support around it. And that may very well include needing some support around communications. And there are lots of reasons why people don't tell their employer. And so if you go back to what Hector was saying about that whole inclusive design as standards, you remove the need for people to have to ask for it, and then it's just there and they can get on with doing their job and being productive. So it really is so important. And Sarah, if somebody is beginning their journey with inclusive comms, what are the first things you would suggest they look at?
Sorry, I was just answering something that came through on the chat box there at the same time. I would say go to the practical resources section and start there. Probably the first resource that's in there you'll find helpful, because that's like a top tips on making your information accessible and inclusive, and that just really gives you a quick overview of, like bullet point form, of just kind of all the areas to look at. And then as you go through the toolkit, you'll find more on each of those areas. So you can also use that as a kind of a quick reminder when you're doing a piece of communication to go back and check it off against that kind of top tips list. So I'd say start with that. I'd say definitely look at Tracy Lenthall's podcast piece. Sorry, Tracy, I know she could make her blush now because she's on the panel, but I think it really explains well why inclusive communication is so important, and just the difference it can make to people's lives and to all of our lives. So do make sure you listen to that. And then I would say probably from that, think about the communications you're using on a daily basis, look at the resources that relate to that. And then when you're looking at a broader level within your organisation, go to the deeper dive section created by Catherine, looking at the sort of more of your kind of reviewing your communications and then developing an inclusive communication policy. So hopefully that's helpful. And just quickly, I know somebody just asked about, just because I'm just trying to type it in, but it was tricky talking at the same time. Somebody was just asking about the fact that I said the toolkit doesn't look at really face-to-face communications, and about kind of online meetings at the moment. There is a resource in there on that. So if you go into the practical resource section, there is a resource on holding meetings, both face-to-face and online meetings as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I was about to say, are there any questions? But I can see that there is tons of stuff in the chat box, including a very kind offer to translate the toolkit into Russian. So that's really interesting. We should follow that one up. So Bella is going to help field some questions for the panel. Hello, Bella.
Hello.
So what have we got?
We have tons of questions, as you said, Diane. So one that's coming through quite a lot is about people who are not tech savvy. Georgina, I hear you. You say my mum here. How do we help create inclusive communications for people who are unable to use tech, or for people who are not tech savvy?
That sounds like a Hector-ish sort of a question to start with. Can I come to you, Hector?
I knew you were coming to me there. Well, there's a few things here that are interesting. I mean, you're really talking about digital skills. Yeah? And if you look at all of the announcements happening around the economy right now and the inclusive recovery, there's this big piece that jobs of the future are changing. The general level of digital skills needs an uplift, right? Now, when we think about people who are not tech savvy, I don't think we should just accept we're not tech savvy. We should be signposting people to the tools and the tips to make stuff accessible. So Tracy was talking earlier about dyslexia. That's an interesting one, in that, we now live in a world where every website can be read aloud just by right-clicking on the text and asking it to read to you. Now, that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. That's not going to be the one solution that fits all. But unless we really raise awareness that it exists, yeah, we're not going to get beyond this "they're not tech savvy" conversation. Yeah, it's like if you look at the most common form of communication amongst people with low functioning literacy, they're using voice recording in WhatsApp and emoji, right, and GIF, right? Okay, so this tech savviness comes in lots of different forms, is what I would say, and it all comes back to this: how do you want it? You've got to build a culture where it's okay to ask, and there's a clear place to ask for that information. I mean, I have deep concerns. This is not a political comment, but I have deep concerns about we've done it in easy read. It's like, easy read is, do we know how many people read easy read documents? But it's been kind of this accepted format, without actually having a conversation with the user group themselves about how should we evolve this process. Yeah. So if you think now, we're going to very shortly live in a world where every website will be able to click into read mode, have it in whatever font size you want, click on a picture and click on a word that you don't understand and have a picture there to represent it immediately on all websites everywhere. Yeah. Should we be forcing people down this easy read format and just saying, tick box, we've given you easy read? We need a dialogue coming back from people, but we also need to put the onus back on individuals to keep up to speed with the norm now. What is it? What is the new normal in terms of digital accessibility? We're working with Signly through our Microsoft Startup program, which is how to embed British Sign Language in websites. Now, over time, we think companies are going to want to do that kind of thing. The beauty of that is that as long as you've got that you've got it installed on your browser as a browser extension, every website that's got that available will just come up. So they've really thought about the signposting of the feature. So digital skills and signposting to me are the two things we really need to lock people on, and maybe moving a bit away from plug-in accessibility tools. This idea that we've provided you an alternative, click that button, you get it differently. It has to be more routinely designed into the experience over time. I rambled a bit there, Diane. I'm sorry.
No, that was absolutely fine. And on the learning disability piece and easy read, I mean, a confession. Before I joined BDF, I spent 13 years at a learning disability organisation with Sarah, actually. So we did an awful lot around accessible communication and easy read. And I love easy read because it's the discipline of forcing yourself to actually say what you really mean, and undoing all those years of academia where they try and make you obscure what you really mean with clever clever long words. It's very therapeutic. I recommend it. But one of the issues is that as you rightly say, it hasn't evolved in terms of imagery often. That, you know, the images could be a lot better. The image banks need to be much, much richer. And there also isn't a standard for easy read. So some organisations were producing documents that they were calling easy read because they had pictures. But actually, they weren't really very simple, and that kind of whole thing of one concept per sentence, etc., etc., etc. But
it goes back to the blue paper analogy earlier, doesn't it? It's like, we've done blue paper.
Yeah.
It's like, no, what you've got to do is give people a set of tools, and let them design the way they want to receive this information, and then save that setting, right? You know, that's where we've got to move towards.
Sort of individualization of consuming the content. But I mean, you know, everything should be easy to read, whether it's easy read or not. We should make it accessible to as many people as possible. And if we bake in inclusion from the start, then we'll remove that need. And I was thinking about what Angela was saying at the beginning about, you know, people saying, oh, do we need 500 Braille copies or 5,000 or whatever? Well, no, of course not, because you haven't been asked for those. So, you know, and you're assuming that every blind person is a Braille reader, and they're not. Or that's the only way, you know, physical Braille is the only way to read it, which it isn't, you know, because technology is coming in there. And so we, you know, stop making assumptions and involve stakeholders, such as older people, in product design and that education piece that Hector articulated so clearly.
Yes, completely.
Sorry to jump in.
No, thank you. It was really a great addition, and I think if you haven't already realised it, all our panellists are extremely passionate about this topic. So I think we could probably have done a sort of 3-hour webinar actually. Whether anyone would have listened to that is another matter, of course. There were a couple of questions around the link to the toolkit, and it is now in the chat box. You'll probably have to scroll up a bit, and we'll be sending it around afterwards, I think, to all participants as well. So do have a dig into that. What else do we have for questions?
Right, well, there's quite a lot on where do I start, how do I make a Word or a PDF or a PowerPoint accessible, and I think the answer to that is it's in the toolkit, so do look at that. There is a question, is there anyone who's doing this well that they can look at? So is there examples of people doing this well, other than Microsoft, obviously?
Who wants to take that one?
I'd say look at the case study examples in the toolkit. I think everybody, probably always organisations, will say they've got more to learn, because I think we've all just agreed it's a bit of a journey. But I think that will give you some examples of kind of practical examples of things that organisations are doing and can do. Because I think sometimes there is that thing of thinking, what does it really all mean? You know, like what changes can I actually make? So yeah, have a look at that. That will give you a good place to start.
Another question that's coming through is about the inclusivity of language. I don't know that that's particularly in this toolkit, but how do we ensure that language is inclusive?
It actually is in the toolkit.
Oh, it is in the toolkit.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a document on language, so it should be in the practical resource section. Again, that is an evolving area too, and it's a very personal thing, I think, language. And how somebody chooses to describe themselves and how you is not necessarily the same as how they would like you to describe them. And I think that's really important. And I also think probably thinking about things like, do you need to mention a person's disability? Sometimes you don't. And, you know, about labelling, things like that. I imagine Ange might have a view on this, and Tracy might also have some views on this. So I will stay quiet now.
But on the language point, there's also, you know, making it easy. Microsoft has this fantastic built-in tool, and you can check the reading age of any Word document that you're producing, and you know, you should just get into the habit of doing that and seeing, you know, what sort of age range, a reading age, could access that information, and that's a really good starting point. And you'll soon learn that you need to make your sentences more active, less passive, and shorter, clearer, to make them more accessible and understandable by everybody.
Yes. Sorry, Tracy.
No, I just want to say I just completely agree with that, and actually not using long words. And quite often certain industries, or which are understandable, you know, have the business speak, and it's trying to, for me, stay away from that and think about it in layman's terms. So how would other people actually understand what is being used from a language perspective, but clear, succinct, and to the point, definitely. And that would be for everybody's benefit as well.
The more I think about this, the more I think we need to get to the education system, actually, to undo a lot of that stuff, which is that long words are better, that passive sentences sound cleverer and more sophisticated, and be able to build in, actually, that you need to be accessible and inclusive as well as understanding how to pronounce the word paradigm, which took me probably much longer than it should have done. Angela, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. Just on the point of depending on who asked the question, if what sort of area of language you meant, really. So just to say, through the advice service, we also, when we review documents for members, we look at sort of, as well as the language in terms of clear English or shorter sentences and plain words, we also look about how we're talking about disability, and as Hector said earlier, and also Catherine, how the language you use is complementing your brand as well. And also we have conversations about sometimes how someone wants to talk about their disability or condition is actually connected to who they are as a person as well, so their cultural background, their beliefs, their gender sometimes as well. So if that's what the our colleague who was asking the question wanted to talk about, give the advice team a call. We talk about it a lot.
Yes, thank you, Angela. And that's a very important reminder. If you are a member or a partner of BDF, and if you're not, then please join us. The advice service is there to answer all these sorts of questions. So please do use them. In the question as well about who's doing it well, I would also like to highlight Skipton Building Society, whose idea it was for the toolkit in the first place. They are absolutely committed to getting this right. And I had a brilliant discussion with Danny Payne around how they'd gone through redesigning their online colour palette to make it accessible and how they got the team on board. So there's some really good practical stuff in there to help you influence in your own organisations too. I'm conscious we are practically at 12 o'clock, so there's probably time for a very, very quick pithy question before I wrap up.
Okay, pithy questions. Are emojis inaccessible?
Go on, Hector.
The answer is no, they're not. But what they are is multiple unnecessary emojis are unpleasant. Not inaccessible, but unpleasant. So that was the point we were referring to earlier. By themselves, no, they all have image description behind them. You know, they are all described. So no, they are by design accessible.
But use sparingly is the message.
But use them appropriately.
Appropriately,
yeah.
Because screen readers read them out. So yeah, screen readers read them out. So if you've got like smiley face, smiley face, smiley face, smiley face, it's really irritating.
Yeah, so use sparingly, appropriately, and pleasantly, I think is the message there. So thank you so much to all our panelists. It's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you all for joining too, and for the great questions, and just the volume that there is on the chat function, I think shows how much interest and passion there is around this. So hopefully we'll be able to share that afterwards. So I would like to say again a big thanks to all our speakers, to Angela, to Catherine, to Sarah, to Jacob, to Tracy, to Hector, and also to Bella for fielding the questions. Also a big thank you to Elaine from My Clear Text from captioning. It's always at this point I remember that I talk too quickly, so I'm sorry about that, Elaine. Another big thank you to our steering group, Skipton Building Society, Atos, Norton Rose Fulbright, Lambeth Council, Danske Bank, Dimensions, Microsoft, Virgin Media, Croydon NHS Trust, London Fire Brigade and the AA, and to Big Voice Communications, and a huge thank you to Skipton Building Society for making this possible, and particularly to Hannah Hall and Danny Payne for their input. And last of all, thank you all for joining us. We hope you find the toolkit really useful and it helps you in your journey to being more disability smart in your communications. If you have any questions, you can visit our website, email us at inquiries@businessdisabilityforum.org.uk, or of course, call our advice service. We look forward to seeing you again soon.